Hi everybody. Since I won't be able to be in class on Friday, I thought I would knock together a little video showing you some of my ideas about the ELA content map. So to start with, this is very much a work in progress, and I kind of started in this general area by thinking about, let's try that again. There we go. This general area by thinking about how to identify just basically what the purpose of the work you're looking at is. So, being able to identify based on the structure, whether you've got a play or a white paper or a piece of prose or poetry, which is its own little thing, we'll kind of tackle that separately, I think is really important. So I mentioned, first of all, I'm thinking about the structural cues to the purpose. And if we back up a step even to think about the purpose of the work as a whole, the written word, as far as I'm concerned, is there to communicate in a speaker's absence. So my tone of voice, my body language, that sort of thing doesn't really come through in the written word. In video, it comes through a little bit better, or in audio, I should say. So to be able to have students notice, for instance, that commas don't exist when we're speaking because we don't need them. We punctuate our items in a series, for instance. So that's kind of where I was thinking. So I noticed as I was looking at, kind of thinking about what makes up the English language, we've really got kind of two things, and that's where I kind of divide this up. We've got our words on the page, and then we've got the markings themselves. Words have been pretty clearly defined, and I'll get to that in a second. Markings as well have been pretty clearly defined. If you think about, what the purpose of the markings are, they clarify meaning, as I mentioned. And then there's a couple things they do. They divide, they add emphasis. And then over here, I've made just sort of a brief brainstorm of some marks that we should probably tackle and what their purpose is, even including things like italics, font type, font considerations. If we follow back to words for a second, I noticed the first thing you're going to see in a work of prose, if you think of starting at the macro level, is going to be paragraphs. Those paragraphs are made up of sentences. Those sentences are made up of phrases. Those phrases are made up of words. And then that map gets a little more detailed on the next couple pages. There are other kinds of words. If you follow this arrow over, there's other kinds of words other than nouns and verbs and adverbs and adjectives over here. Adjectives. We've got articles, conjunctions, and so on. But they all pretty much have a purpose. And by the way, this comment here left of the blue wall, there is a Radiolab report about how the human brain actually changes once basically they acquire prepositions in particular, so that might be worth pursuing. Okay, so now we're kind of zooming in a little bit to a document, and I kind of I decided as my starting point to kind of use sentences, because sentences, they're kind of a mid-level thing. You need to understand some words, you need to understand, and some marks, by the way. You also need to understand what the purpose of a document is as a whole. So it's kind of a mid place to start. So I've laid out here pretty clearly, there are 4 types of sentences. Each of them has a different purpose, as I've mentioned over here. There are many different kinds of words, and those really get divided from a linguistic point of view into their function, their word class. Open class, and linguistics was not my forte, although an interest of mine. Open class, from what I understand, has to do with we can still add words to it, whereas closed class, there's only so many ways to express a certain item, and therefore it is now closed. We don't need any new ways to express it. So I'll get into that in just a second. But basically, this would be what I'm perceiving as, any of this stuff on this page would be what I'm perceiving as kind of the lowlands leading up to Mount ELA. So, to prepare some documents or some problems that had students identify which of these things in the sentence is a noun versus a verb, maybe asking them, could you replace certain verbs to make the sentence communicate this more clearly? That would get into connotative versus denotative purpose of words, for instance. Adverbs, can you identify the adverbs? Which verb are they modifying? I'm thinking about old school sentence diagramming, which I always loved. Preposition, being able to divide, if we go back up to the fact that they're made up of phrases, for instance, being able to recognize which phrases are dependent upon others, which are independent phrases that can really function on their own, I think is really important. So that might be kind of where we start here. Noticing, for instance, pronouns are replacing nouns. So being able to identify which pronouns are missing, or maybe how could we clarify this sentence? Well, we need to identify what the noun is before we refer to it, I think might be important as well. And so that's kind of where I was thinking in terms of the words to start with. We start with sentences, kinds of sentences, and then kind of peel back the layers of kinds of sentences. Well, sentences, again, are made of words, so what are the words in them? Okay, so these are the content words. These, we've got nouns, for instance. These are fairly open class, if I remember correctly. Nouns, we're always adding new nouns to as we invent and develop new things that need to be talked about. So just to have students identify, like, what are the things that make up a noun, for instance. Proper nouns, how are they different? Will they name a noun? Proper noun. Adjectives answer these 4 questions. Adverbs have similar things that they answer. I can work on that a little bit more. And then I was thinking, adjectives are really, if you think about it, a way to modify a noun. So to get into what kinds of noun modifiers we have might be significant. Verbs, verbs are things, again, like Google, for instance, became a verb a couple years back, 2007, 2008. It was put in the dictionary. So, to be able to add a list of verbs, I think what I'm really getting at here is kind of vocabulary, and maybe teachers talk about different tiers of words. So tier 1 words are things all people use. Tier 2 words are a little bit specific. Tier 3 words are things you probably never hear outside of that content-specific class. So, in science class, they might be things like, mercury or whatever. In an English class, they would be things like characterization and motivation, and those very specific literary terms, not necessarily verbs. But where I'm going with this is that I think this is where it gets very, very muddy in terms of what words students might be needing to know. As new ones, English is a very slippery slope, and new ones are always being created. The function words, though, I have to say, are something I'm much more comfortable kind of talking about. So again, these are closed class, that we don't really need in English any other ways than these ways right here to express a personal pronoun. If you are referring to yourself, how many ways do you possibly need? So it's pretty well closed, which to me means it's a little more tackleable, something we can really bite off and chew. So again, this is comes mainly from Wikipedia's linguistics page. But I think this would be something we could certainly dive into and create some content for the game addressing these sorts of questions and just basically asking students to be able to identify what an article is. Not because it's important to know what an article is, but because it informs the way you understand the work as a whole. If you understand what the job of each word in the sentence is. And that's usually how I teach part of speech to students, is what is the job of this word. Okay, so to go back to the beginning, you can see why English is a little bit of a fuzzy thing to work on. We have many, many, many different genres that writing could take. We have many different ways to accomplish it. Poetry, as I said, we'll get to later on, because as I mentioned here, it's really a response to prose. So you have to understand prose before you can really understand how poetry is playing around with those conventions. I think the marks, for instance, and the very specific functions of words would be something we can really tackle. So I did try to knock this together into something like a terrain map. It's very drafty at this point, but since I won't be there on Friday, let me share with you what I have. Okay, so I started on the left-hand side kind of thinking of it as a topo map, which became very muddy very quickly. But basically, I transposed it into a kind of a side view map. And so basically what I'm thinking is at the top, we're going to have Mount ELA. That's the very top of the peak. And so what is Mount ELA, as I mentioned over here? To me, it's the ability to both produce a text and consume a text purposefully. So knowing who the audience is, knowing what the audience, what expectations the audience brings with them to receiving your text, whether it's a video or an essay or a piece of code for that matter, knowing what their expectations are, I think are really important. So your goal as a good student of ELA is both to be a purposeful producer of text and a purposeful consumer of text. And so if we kind of peel away the layers of that a little bit, we'll go back to the side map. We can see at Mount ELA we have a whole bunch of things going on. Poetry is back in the distance because, again, that's kind of its own little mountain all to itself, as is Lit Crit, by the way. It's writing meta literature, writing about literature. But I think some things on the way to the peak of Mount ELA should certainly be prose, maybe even poetry, depending on how we think of that. And of course, to understand prose, things written in sentences and paragraphs, we need to understand the marks, the points of punctuation, the symbols, as well as the words on the page and how they function together. So I've basically divided this, if you look right here, kind of think of that as the cloud line, or maybe the scrub tree line. And so above that is where we have the, as I word it, the macro view of English language arts. So sentences, paragraphs, whole text, how do the individual parts of that work together to inform our comprehension or to communicate to others. And then underneath this cloud line, we have kind of the micro view. So this is understanding each of the pieces. Going back above the cloud line here, I mentioned, we'll go back to that actually in a second. Below the cloud line, let's focus there. Below the cloud line, some of the things I was kind of tossing around, things I feel comfortable tackling at this stage would be kind of a word plateau, which I think would be a little higher up than the Marx Marsh, as I called it. The word plateau would have things in it like, vocabulary. I think a great place to start would be Latin and Greek root words that are the basis for many of our words in English. I'm not sure exactly where we could find this, but I'm sure that if I got in touch with some other English teachers and maybe some classics teachers, we could pretty clearly nail down, maybe our top 100, let's say, Latin and or Greek root words. And kind of start with that. Just a basic understanding of what each word means is pretty critical. Related to that, I think a sub-peak related to on our word plateau might be something about prefixes and suffixes and how they function with the Latin and or Greek roots to form a whole word. So really taking a word apart and helping students to understand how those letters, if you want to get even more nitpicky, how those letters come to form those words. And actually thinking about Khan Academy's model, the letters might be akin to his number line, which is the very first thing you do on your way to Mount Calculus, or whatever mount you're going to is the number line. So I think that might be critical, is to kind of work out prefixes, suffixes, Greek, Latin roots, and even letters. Parts of speech, for instance, I think are related to your understanding of vocabulary, because then you understand the function of the word, what job it's doing in the sentence. So that's kind of its own little land, word plateau. Another one would be the Marx Marsh, and so this would have, our mount would be understanding how marks function within a work of prose or poetry or literature, whatever it is. So, for instance, we should definitely talk about commas, semicolons, dashes, basically those items that were over here on that first page, I think would be where I would start with that, developing our marks and what we would ask them. And if we go back up to the top of Mount ELA, if the purpose of, getting to the top of Mount ELA, again, is to both be able to understand, create, and produce, consume and produce a text, then I was trying to figure out how works of literature and other pre-produced texts might relate to this, and I was viewing them as kind of clouds that would be circling around this Mount ELA, kind of breezing through it, having Mount ELA slice them. So, for instance, we would have works of literature here, perhaps as models. So I could see taking, George Orwell's 1984 at the very top of Mount ELA and asking students to explain, maybe via an essay. I can't imagine you'd be able to do it any shorter than that, how the book within a book, Goldstein's book, for instance, is reflective of the work as a whole and how it relates to Winston's journal, or how Orwell has purposely crafted this, that, or the other sentence, or why he jumps us into, in the Goldstein book, chapter 3 as opposed to chapter 1 first, how he's playing with our expectations. So works that already exist would kind of be a way for us to explore how the author has, for instance, purposely produced a text such that we can purposefully consume it. And then I was thinking about what we were talking about last week about code and how that might relate to this. So I think computer code would also be a cloud that floats through. So I was talking with a student trying to get him hooked on learning how to code, and I was showing him various ways of accomplishing Hello World in different formats. So we kind of browsed through, I think it was the Wikipedia page on Hello World, and he got to look at how it would be accomplished in Java versus how it is accomplished in iOS versus how it's accomplished in Python. And he was able to see how the functionality is kind of built into the language. So I think that is one way we might be able to tie that. And then I was thinking maybe at the top of Mount ELA we have a portal of some sort to, I'm not sure what, CS land, computer land, coding, I'm not sure exactly, but I think it's important to make the point that the purpose of this purposeful communication, both production and consumption, is still relevant in the world of computers. So I hope this was helpful. I didn't mean to make it 15 minutes long. Please send me any questions or emails along the way. And by the way, I made this video, if you're unfamiliar with this, I used it used a program called Doodlecast, which is free. It's an app that both me and my students use for this sort of direct instruction and communicating in our absences. So feel free to look up Doodlecast or to ask me about both the process and the content of this. Thanks very much, guys.